Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a highly detailed political narrative surrounding a hypothetical crisis during the local elections on June 3rd, 2026. What we're unpacking here is the anatomy of a very specific claim, a look at a narrative describing an unprecedented systemic breakdown right in the heart of South Korea's democratic process. Let's break down exactly how the source material constructs this argument.
To help us navigate this, we'll follow a quick six-part breakdown. First up, the 2026 ballot crisis. Second, targeting the Gangnam districts. Third, the political fallout. Fourth, the German precedent. Fifth, protests and martial law. And finally, the NEC's legal immunity.
All right, Part 1, the 2026 ballot crisis and the unfolding local election claims.
The source narrative places us right on Election Day, specifically at the Jeomsil 2-dong 6th polling station. Picture this, it's 1 p.m. and they just run out of ballots. At first, voters figure, hey, it's just a minor delay, right? But 1 hour bleeds into 2 and then 3. The frustration really builds. The source specifically mentions a parent who brought their child, waited 3 grueling hours, and finally had to just give up and go home without voting. By 4:30 p.m., voting is completely suspended, leaving over 100 people stranded outside in line.
And the source highlights that this was not just some isolated glitch. They point to 14 specific polling stations that supposedly ran dry, spread across 3 major districts, Songpa-gu, Gangnam-gu, and Gwangjin-gu. Having 14 different locations simultaneously fail to give citizens ballots, the narrative frames this as a massive, glaring red flag in election management.
Now, here is a really striking detail from the source. It claims the National Election Commission, the NEC, offered a rather shocking explanation, stating they deliberately only printed ballots for 50% of eligible voters. Just imagine being told you literally can't vote because authorities decided ahead of time to only print enough paper for half the town. The source uses this specific detail to argue that we're not just looking at a simple accident here.
Moving on to Part 2, targeting the Gangnam districts and the demographic argument. The source material then pivots to look at the actual geographic and demographic makeup of these polling stations. And this is where the narrative shifts from administrative incompetence to targeted disruption. The crucial point the creator makes is that the affected voters were heavily concentrated in the affluent Gangnam 3-gu areas. These are districts historically known for their overwhelming support of conservative figures, like Oh Se-hoon. The argument here is that this wasn't just a random distribution of errors, but a crisis that disproportionately hit a very specific political demographic. To back this up, the source points straight to the Jeomsil 7-dong polling station. Back in 2022, Oh Se-hoon captured a massive 81% of the vote there. The narrative argues that depriving voters in an area with an 81% political tilt essentially alters the entire landscape of the election. When citizens in these specific districts are told they can't vote because of a paper shortage, the source categorizes it as a profound violation of their fundamental constitutional rights. That brings us to Part 3, the political fallout and the divided reactions. So, how do politicians react to an unprecedented event like this? The source outlines a really stark divide. On one side, the Democratic Party and the Blue House reportedly refuse a revote and distance themselves, basically telling the NEC, hey, this is your mess, you handle it. But on the flip side, the People Power Party, and notably Lee Jun-sok, demand an immediate halt to the counting. The narrative specifically highlights that even a figure like Lee, who usually rejects election conspiracies outright, was forced by the sheer scale of this ballot shortage to demand an immediate revote. Next up is Part 4, the German precedent, offering an international comparison. To give us some context on the Korean response, the source looks overseas to see how other democracies handle this exact same problem. They contrast the NEC's refusal to hold a revote against a real-world precedent in Germany. The argument is that any normal democratic country would simply nullify the results and start over. While the Korean NEC offered a public apology, they drew a hard line against delaying the election. But in Germany, a virtually identical situation of missing ballots led the courts to invalidate the election and order a total revote. The source leaves us with a lingering question: why is South Korea's system acting so differently? Which leads right into Part 5, protests and martial law, marking the escalation. Following the NEC's refusal, the narrative escalates dramatically into widespread civil unrest. Enraged citizens gather at multiple locations, and they aren't just quick protests.
Crowds surround the NEC headquarters in Gwacheon and flood the streets around the Jamsil polling stations, staying until the early hours of the morning. They're actively chanting against election fraud. The argument presented here is that this has moved way past a simple administrative hiccup. It has become a full-blown crisis of public confidence.
And then the narrative asserts an unprecedented executive action. President Yoon Suk-yeol deploying martial law troops directly to the Election Commission. The source argues this happens because the flawed voting system had completely destroyed public trust. The core systems managing the democracy are described as being so compromised that normal procedures are totally useless. Therefore, according to the claim, the president takes the extraordinary step of sending in martial law troops to secure the NEC and force an investigation.
Finally, we reach Part 6, the NEC's legal immunity and institutional roadblocks.
To really understand the climax of this narrative, you have to understand the NEC's unique legal status. The source defines the NEC as a constitutional institution. Because it's populated by members of the judiciary, it sits inside this protected bubble within the government structure. This grants it unique and powerful legal protections against standard law enforcement.
So the underlying argument here is that the NEC operates with an institutional immunity that blocks forced investigations. You can't just send the police in with a warrant to raid the NEC. Their protected status makes standard search and seizures practically impossible. The narrative frames this as the ultimate systemic flaw. An institution that manages the absolute most critical aspect of democracy is essentially untouchable by regular law enforcement. And according to the source, that is exactly why the situation culminates in the use of martial law troops.
Based on the claims we've unpacked, the source leaves us with a critical structural dilemma. If a democratic system's core electoral institution is legally immune to forced investigation, how can citizens maintain trust when an unprecedented failure occurs? When the entity responsible for fair elections fails so spectacularly, at least as depicted in this narrative, and can't be investigated by normal means, what recourse do the people actually have? It's a powerful question about accountability and the safeguards of democracy that perfectly caps off this incredibly detailed narrative.